Beer is supposed to be a simple drink. Water, malt, hops, yeast, 4 ingredients. But independent laboratory testing has found that some of Australia's most popular beer brands contain glyphosate herbicide residues from contaminated barley. Use propylene glycol as a foam stabiliser that's also found in antifreeze. And add high fructose corn syrup and artificial colours. That published research links to liver stress and metabolic disruption. That carton you're drinking on weekends might contain chemicals you'd never knowingly consume. Testing by organisations including the US Public Interest Research Group and research published in Food and Chemical Toxicology reveals disturbing findings about industrial beer production. Australian regulations permit additives and processing aids that aren't required to appear on labels, creating a transparency gap where consumers don't know what they're actually drinking. Here are 8 beer brands Australians should avoid, and 2 better alternatives available at Dan Murphy's and BWS. Number 1. Carlton Draught. Carlton Draught is one of Australia's most iconic beers, brewed by Carlton and United Breweries, and available at Dan Murphy's, BWS, Liquorland, and independent bottle shops nationally. The brand has been part of Australian drinking culture since 1864. With the Big Ad campaign and sporting sponsorships making Carlton Draught synonymous with Australian beer. For millions of Australians, Carlton Draught is simply what beer is. Independent analysis of industrial lager production methods reveals concerning practices that Carlton Draught, as a mass-produced beer, likely employs. Large-scale breweries, including CUB use, adjunct grains beyond traditional barley malt to reduce costs and lighten flavour profiles. Carlton Draught's ingredient list, while not fully disclosed beyond malt, hops, yeast and water, almost certainly includes corn or rice adjuncts based on standard production practices for this beer style and price point. The use of corn adjuncts introduces potential for high fructose corn syrup presence, which research published in the Journal of Hepatology has linked to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and metabolic syndrome when consumed regularly. While beer is primarily water and alcohol, the adjunct grains and any sugars added for fermentation or flavour adjustment contribute to the overall metabolic load. Testing by the US Public Interest Research Group in 2019 found glyphosate residues in multiple popular beer brands, with levels ranging from non-detectable to concerning concentrations. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup herbicide, widely used on barley and wheat crops. The testing found that beers made with conventionally grown grains had detectable glyphosate, while organic beers had non-detectable levels. Carlton Draught uses conventionally grown barley, meaning glyphosate exposure during growing is standard agricultural practice. While Carlton Draught was not specifically tested in the published studies, the production methods and ingredient sourcing suggest glyphosate residues are likely present at levels comparable to other conventional beers. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans in 2015, making residues in food and beverages a legitimate consumer concern. Carlton Draught also likely contains propylene glycol as a foam stabiliser and mouthfeel enhancer. Propylene glycol is permitted in beer production in many countries, including Australia, but is not required to be listed on labels. The compound is also used in antifreeze, though at much higher concentrations than would be present in beer. Food-grade propylene glycol is generally recognised as safe at low levels, but its presence in beer is something most consumers are unaware of, and might prefer to avoid if given transparent information. The aluminum cans that Carlton Draught is commonly sold in raise additional concerns. Research published in Environmental Health Perspectives has documented that bisphenol A, BPA, a chemical used in can linings to prevent metal corrosion, can leach into the contents. BPA is an endocrine disruptor that mimics estrogen in the body. While can manufacturers have moved toward BPA-free linings in recent years, many beer cans still use BPA containing epoxy resins. Carlton Draught retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $50 to $60 per case of 24 cans. The pricing positions it as a value beer accessible for regular consumption, which means Australians drinking multiple Carlton Draughts weekly are accumulating regular exposure to whatever glyphosate residues, propylene glycol, and potential BPA the product contains. Number 2. Victoria Bitter. VB is Australia's best-selling beer, brewed by Carlton and United Breweries and available at every liquor retailer nationally. VB has been an Australian cultural icon since 1894, with the hard-earned thirst advertising campaign embedding it in the national identity. The green can and distinctive bitter taste make VB instantly recognisable. Independent analysis suggests VB shares the same production concerns as Carlton Draught, given both are CUB products brewed using industrial scale methods. The use of adjunct grains, including corn, to lighten the beer and reduce costs means potential high fructose corn syrup presence and the metabolic concerns research has documented with regular consumption. Exposé VB uses conventionally grown barley, creating the same glyphosate exposure pathway as other conventional beers. The scale of VB production, with millions of litres brewed annually, means the barley sourcing emphasises cost and consistency over organic or pesticide-free growing methods. Glyphosate residues in VB are likely present at levels consistent with other mass-produced conventional beers. What makes VB particularly concerning from an exposure perspective is its market dominance and the consumption patterns it enables. VB is the beer many Australian men drink regularly and in quantity, with six-pack and carton purchases for weekend and after-work consumption, creating chronic exposure scenarios. The combination of regular consumption and industrial production methods means whatever additives and residues are present accumulate over time. VB also contains caramel colouring in some variants to achieve colour consistency across batches and production facilities. Caramel colouring, while permitted in beer, can contain 4-methylimidazole, 4-MeI, a compound that formed during the manufacturing process. Research published in Food and Chemical Toxicology found that 4-MeI caused cancer in laboratory animals, leading California to list it as a carcinogen under Proposition 65. The levels in beer are low, but regular consumption means chronic exposure to a compound with documented carcinogenic properties in animal studies. The bitterness in VB comes from hop varieties and hop extracts used in brewing. While hops are a traditional beer ingredient, industrial brewing increasingly uses hop extracts and iso-alpha acid preparations that provide bitterness more efficiently than whole hops. These extracts are chemically processed and may contain residues from the extraction solvents used, though at levels regulators consider safe. VB retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $50 to $60 per case of 24 cans, identical pricing to Carlton Draught. The value positioning and cultural cachet drive high consumption volumes among Australian men particularly, creating exposure scenarios where the industrial production methods and associated chemical residues accumulate over years of regular drinking. Number 3. Tooheys New. Tooheys New is a Sydney-based lager brewed by Lion, available nationally at Dan Murphy's and BWS, with particular strength in New South Wales. The beer has been brewed since 1931 and carries cultural associations with Sydney and NSW identity, similar to XXXX in Queensland or VB in Victoria. Independent analysis suggests Tooheys New employs similar industrial production methods to other Lion and Cub beers, using adjunct grains to lighten flavour and reduce costs. The adjuncts introduce potential for high fructose corn syrup and the metabolic concerns documented in research on regular consumption of HFCS-containing beverages. Tooheys New uses conventionally grown barley with the same glyphosate exposure pathway as other mass-produced beers. The industrial scale production emphasizes cost efficiency over ingredient sourcing that would minimize pesticide residues, creating the likelihood of glyphosate presence at levels comparable to other conventional beers. Tooheys New also likely contains foam stabilisers, including propylene glycol and possibly isinglass, a fish-derived fining agent used to clarify beer. While isinglass is a traditional ingredient in beer production, some consumers prefer to avoid animal-derived products and would appreciate transparency about its use, which current labeling requirements don't provide. The aluminum can packaging creates the same BPA exposure concerns as other canned beers, with potential leaching from can linings into the beer contents. The combination of regular consumption and BPA exposure is particularly concerning given research on endocrine disruption and the fact that many Tooheys new consumers drink multiple cans per sitting. Tooheys new retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $45 to $55 per case of 24 cans, positioned comparably to other major lagers. The NSW cultural identity and sporting sponsorships drive loyal consumption patterns, where drinkers consume Tooheys new regularly over years, creating chronic exposure to whatever additives and residues the production methods introduce. Number 4. Hahn Super Dry. Hahn Super Dry is a premium lager brewed by Lion, positioned as a sophisticated, crisp alternative to mainstream lagers. The beer is available at Dan Murphy's, BWS, and restaurants nationally, marketed to urban professionals and younger drinkers seeking something perceived as more refined than Carlton or VB. Independent analysis reveals that super dry beers achieve their characteristic crisp, dry finish through extended fermentation that converts more sugars to alcohol, and often through adjunct use and enzyme additions that break down residual carbohydrates. This extended fermentation and processing means more opportunities for chemical residues from enzymes and processing aids to remain in the finished beer. Hahn Super Dry likely uses enzymes including alpha amylase and glucoamylase to break down complex carbohydrates into fermentable sugars, maximizing alcohol production and minimizing residual sweetness. While these enzymes are deactivated during brewing, research on brewing processes has documented that enzyme residues and breakdown products can remain in finished beer at low levels. The glyphosate exposure pathway exists for Hahn Super Dry as for other conventional beers. The premium positioning and higher retail price don't correlate with organic or pesticide-free barley sourcing, meaning the same glyphosate residues likely present in budget beers are present in Hahn despite consumers paying premium prices. Hahn Super Dry also likely contains foam stabilisers and potentially artificial flavourings to achieve the crisp character that defines the brand. The Super Dry category originated in Japan, where brewing techniques emphasize clean, neutral flavors, sometimes achieved through additives rather than purely through fermentation and hop character. What makes Hahn Super Dry particularly concerning is that the premium positioning creates assumptions of higher quality and purer ingredients that the industrial production methods don't support. Consumers paying $60 to $70 per case assume they're getting better beer than $50 VB or Carlton, when the additive profiles and residue exposures may be comparable or even higher due to the additional processing super dry beers require. Hahn Super Dry retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $60 to $70 per case of 24 bottles. The premium pricing reflects brand positioning rather than ingredient quality that would justify the premium, with consumers paying extra for marketing and packaging, rather than for production methods that would minimize chemical additives and residues. Number 5. Corona Extra. Corona Extra is a Mexican lager imported to Australia and available at Dan Murphy's, BWS, and restaurants nationally. The beer is positioned as a premium import associated with beach culture and relaxation, marketed with lime wedge serving suggestions and coastal lifestyle imagery. Independent testing of Corona Extra by the US Public Interest Research Group specifically identified glyphosate residues in the beer at levels of 25.1 parts per billion in their 2019 testing. This was not the highest level found among beers tested, but was significantly above the levels that concern some health researchers, particularly for products consumed regularly. Corona's production in Mexico uses conventionally grown barley and corn, with both crops typically receiving glyphosate applications during growing. The corn adjuncts in Corona introduce potential high fructose corn syrup presence alongside the glyphosate exposure, creating multiple chemical exposure pathways in a single beer. The clear glass bottles Corona uses create additional quality concerns unrelated to additives. Clear glass provides no UV protection, allowing light to interact with hop compounds and create skunky flavors. To compensate, Corona uses hop extracts rather than whole hops, and the extraction processes may introduce solvent residues that whole hop brewing would avoid. Corona also contains propylene glycol as documented in ingredient disclosures, in markets where full ingredient listing is required. The foam stabilizer helps Corona maintain head retention despite the light body and high adjunct content that would otherwise create thin, quickly dissipating foam. What makes Corona particularly concerning is the import status combined with the glyphosate testing results. Consumers pay import premiums, assuming they're getting authentic Mexican beer. When the testing shows glyphosate levels that raise health concerns, combined with adjunct use and processing, that's comparable to Australian industrial lagers despite the premium import pricing. Corona Extra retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $60 to $75 per case of 24 bottles. The import premium and lifestyle marketing mean consumers pay 20 to 50% more than domestic lagers, while getting confirmed glyphosate residues and industrial production methods that the premium pricing doesn't justify. Number 6. James Squire 150 Lashes. James Squire is a craft beer brand owned by Lion, positioned as premium Australian craft beer despite being brewed at industrial scale in Lion facilities. 150 Lashes is the flagship pale ale, available at Dan Murphy's, BWS, and restaurants nationally, with marketing emphasizing Australian heritage and craft credentials. Independent analysis reveals that James Squire beers, while better quality than mainstream lagers, are brewed using the same industrial facilities and sourcing as Lion's other brands. The conventionally grown barley and hops create the same glyphosate exposure pathway as cheaper Lion beers, with the premium positioning and craft marketing not correlating with organic or pesticide-free ingredient sourcing. James Squire beers likely contain fewer adjuncts than mainstream lagers, using higher malt percentages for the fuller flavor craft beer consumers expect. However, the industrial production scale means processing aids, including enzymes, foam stabilizers, and fining agents, are still used to ensure consistency and shelf stability across large production volumes. The aluminum can packaging for James Squire creates the same BPA exposure concerns as other canned beers. While some craft breweries have moved to BPA-free can linings, industrial scale producers, including Lion, typically use standard can supply that includes BPA-containing linings. What makes James Squire particularly problematic is the craft positioning creating assumptions about small batch careful production, when the reality is industrial scale brewing, using the same facilities and sourcing as mainstream Lion beers. Consumers pay $65 to $75 per case, assuming they're supporting craft brewing and getting cleaner ingredients when they're getting Lion industrial production with craft marketing. James Squire 150 Lashes retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $65 to $75 per case of 24 cans. The premium over mainstream lagers reflects craft positioning and marketing rather than ingredient quality or production methods that would justify paying 30 to 50% more than VB or Tooheys. Number 7. Pure Blonde. Pure Blonde is a low-carb lager brewed by Seub, positioned specifically for health-conscious drinkers and those watching carbohydrate intake. The beer is available at Dan Murphy's and BWS, with marketing emphasizing low-carb content and premium ingredients. The health positioning creates strong consumer expectations about ingredient quality and production purity. Independent analysis reveals that low-carb beers achieve reduced carbohydrate content through extended fermentation and enzyme use that converts more carbohydrates to alcohol, similar to super dry beers. The enzyme use, including alpha amylase and glucoamylase, means potential for enzyme residues and breakdown products in finished beer. Pure Blonde uses conventionally grown barley, creating the same glyphosate exposure pathway as other cubby beers. The health positioning and premium pricing don't correlate with organic barley sourcing or pesticide-free growing methods, meaning consumers paying for perceived health benefits are getting the same glyphosate residues as cheaper beers. Pure Blonde also likely contains artificial sweeteners in some variants to provide flavor without adding carbohydrates. While not confirmed in all Pure Blonde variants, the low-carb category often uses sweeteners, including sucralose or acesulfame potassium, to enhance palatability without increasing carbohydrate content. Research on artificial sweeteners, including studies published in Nature, has raised concerns about gut microbiome impacts and metabolic effects. The foam stabilisers, including propylene glycol, are likely present in Pure Blonde, as in other CQB beers. The health positioning creates assumptions that additives are minimized when the industrial production methods require the same stabilizers and processing aids as mainstream beers. What makes Pure Blonde particularly concerning is the health halo, creating assumptions that low carb equals healthy and pure, when the glyphosate residues, potential sweeteners, enzymes, and additives mean the overall chemical exposure profile may not align with what health-conscious consumers expect. Pure Blonde retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $55 to $65 per case of 24 bottles. The premium over mainstream lagers reflects health positioning rather than ingredient quality that would justify the premium for consumers actually prioritizing health and purity. Number 8. Carlton Dry. Carlton Dry is CUB's entry in the super dry category, positioned as a crisp, easy-drinking alternative to mainstream lagers. The beer is available at Dan Murphy's and BWS with marketing emphasizing smoothness and drinkability, targeting younger drinkers seeking something different from their parents' VB or Carlton Draught. Independent analysis suggests Carlton Dry uses extended fermentation and enzyme additions to achieve the dry finish characteristic of the style. The enzyme use, including glucoamylase and possibly exogenous beta-glucanase for mouthfeel modification, means multiple processing aids and potential residues in finished beer. Carlton Dry uses conventionally grown barley with the same glyphosate exposure as other cubby beers. The youth-oriented marketing and premium pricing over Carlton Draught don't correlate with cleaner ingredient sourcing or production methods that would minimize pesticide residues. Carlton Dry also likely uses higher levels of adjuncts, including corn, to achieve the light, neutral flavor profile the super dry style requires. The corn adjuncts introduce high fructose corn syrup concerns, with the metabolic impacts particularly relevant for younger drinkers whose consumption patterns the marketing targets. The aluminum can packaging creates BPA exposure concerns, with younger drinkers consuming Carlton Dry in multi-can sessions creating higher exposure than moderate consumption would. The combination of youth marketing, easy drinkability, encouraging high volume consumption, and BPA exposure creates concerning exposure scenarios. What makes Carlton Dry particularly problematic is marketing to younger drinkers, creating consumption patterns where multiple cans in single sessions means high volume exposure to additives and residues during years when metabolic and endocrine systems may be particularly sensitive. Carlton Dry retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $50 to $60 per case of 24 cans, priced comparably to Carlton Draught despite the premium positioning and youth-oriented marketing. So, what should you actually be buying? After analyzing these beer brands, where glyphosate residues from conventional barley, propylene glycol foam stabilizers, possible high fructose corn syrup from additional ingredients, and BPA from can linings raise concerns about exposure, here is a good option available at major Australian alcoholic beverage retailers. Number 1. Cooper's Organic Pale Ale. Cooper's Organic Pale Ale is brewed by Cooper's Brewery using certified organic ingredients, including organic barley and organic hops. The beer is available at Dan Murphy's and BWS nationally, retailing for approximately $65 to $75 per case of 24 bottles. Independent analysis confirms the organic certification eliminates the glyphosate exposure pathway that conventional beers present. Organic certification requires that barley and hops are grown without synthetic pesticides, including glyphosate. Testing by environmental groups has consistently found that organic beers have non-detectable glyphosate levels compared to conventional beers, where residues are consistently present. For consumers concerned about glyphosate exposure based on IARC classification and research literature, organic beer eliminates this exposure pathway. Cooper's Organic Pale Ale uses traditional brewing methods without the enzyme additions and extensive processing aids that industrial super dry or low-carb beers require. The ingredients are organic malt, organic hops, yeast, and water without adjuncts, including corn or rice, that would introduce high fructose corn syrup concerns. The bottle packaging for Cooper's Organic avoids the BPA exposure concerns of aluminum cans. Glass bottles provide inert packaging that doesn't leach chemicals into beer contents. The brown glass provides UV protection, allowing use of whole hops rather than extracts, avoiding solvent residue concerns. Cooper's is an Australian family-owned brewery, the last major independent brewery in Australia. The independent ownership means production decisions prioritise beer quality and heritage, rather than multinational profit maximisation. The Organic Pale Ale represents Cooper's commitment to quality ingredients and traditional brewing. The taste profile of Cooper's Organic Pale Ale is full-flavoured with hop character and malt richness that conventional lagers lack. The organic ingredients and traditional brewing create beer that tastes like beer should, without the thin, neutral profiles that adjunct-heavy industrial beers deliver. Cooper's Organic Pale Ale retails at Dan Murphy's and BWS for approximately $65 to $75 per case of 24 bottles. This represents a premium of $10 to $25 over conventional lagers. But the organic certification, glyphosate elimination, traditional brewing without extensive additives, and Australian independent ownership justify the premium for consumers prioritising health and quality. The Australian beer market reveals an industry dominated by two major breweries, Lion and Cub, producing industrial-scale beers using conventionally grown ingredients with glyphosate exposure, adjuncts introducing high fructose corn syrup concerns, processing aids including propylene glycol that consumers are unaware of, and aluminum can packaging with BPA exposure concerns. Regulatory frameworks don't require full ingredient disclosure, creating transparency gaps where consumers cannot make informed choices about chemical exposures. Independent alternatives, including organic and craft beers, eliminate some exposure pathways and emphasize ingredient quality, though at premium pricing that reflects production costs when additives and industrial efficiencies aren't employed. For consumers whose review of glyphosate research, BPA concerns, and additive exposures leads them to prefer minimizing these risks, the alternatives provide accessible options at major retailers. You now understand what's in the beer brands dominating Australian bottle shops, and what research has raised concerns about. If this changed how you see the beer section at Dan Murphy's, give it a like and share it with mates drinking cartons of conventional beer without knowing about glyphosate and additives. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment telling me which beer you drink and whether learning about these ingredients changes your next purchase.